Jim Bridger, Part 5. During the Indian Campaign of 1865, Bridger guided General Connor's column from Fort Laramie to the Tongue River, where he took part in an Indian fight. Of this expedition, Captain H.E. Palmer of the 11th Kansas Cavalry says in a daily diary he kept throughout the campaign, quote, "When our advance reached the top of the ridge dividing the waters of the Powder River from those of the Tongue, I was riding in the extreme advance in the company with Major Bridger. As we reached the top of the hill, we halted our steeds while I raised my field glasses to my eyes and took in the grandest view I've ever seen. I could see the north end of the Bighorn Range and away beyond the faint outline of the mountains beyond the Yellowstone. Immediately before us lay the valley of Pinot Creek, now called Prairie Dog Creek, and beyond the Little Goose, Big Goose, and Tongue River valleys and many other tributary streams. The morning was clear and bright, with not a breath of air stirring. The old major, sitting on his horse with his eyes shaded by his hands, had been telling me for an hour or more about his Indian life, his 40 years on the plains, telling me how to tell Indian trails and distinguish the tracks of the different tribes, how every spear of grass, every tree and shrub and stone was a compass to an experienced trapper and hunter, a subject that I discussed with him nearly every day. As I lowered my glass from examining the panorama before me, the major said, "Do you see those air columns of smoke over yonder?" I replied, "Where, Major?" To which he answered, "Over by that air saddle," meaning a depression in the hills, not unlike the shape of a saddle, indicating a point nearly 50 miles away. I again raised my glasses and took a long, earnest look, but for the life of me I could not make out any column of smoke, even with a strong field glass. The major was looking without any artificial help. As soon as the general and his staff arrived, I called his attention to Major Bridger's discovery. The general raised his field glasses and scanned the horizon closely. After a long look, he remarked that there were no columns of smoke to be seen. Major Bridger quietly mounted his horse and rode on. I asked the general to look again, as the major was very confident he could see columns of smoke, which of course indicated an Indian village. The general made another examination and again asserted that there were no columns of smoke. However, to satisfy curiosity and to give our guides no chance to claim they had shown us an Indian village and we would not attack it, he suggested to Captain Frank North, who was riding with his staff, that he go with 7 of his Pawnee scouts in the direction indicated to reconnoiter and report to us at Pinot Creek or Tongue River, down which we were to march. I galloped on and overtook the major, and as I came up to him, overheard him remark, "These damn paper-collar soldiers telling him there were no columns of smoke." The old man was very indignant at our doubt in his ability to outsee us, even with the aid of field glasses. Just after sunset on August 27th, 2 of North's Pawnee scouts came into camp with information that Captain North had discovered an Indian village. It was this village which Connor captured next day, the fight being known as the Battle of Tongue River. When Colonel Henry B. Carrington's expedition left Fort Kearny, Nebraska, May 19, 1866, en route to Powder River and Bighorn country to establish the forts which the government had determined to build, later known as Forts Phil Kearny and C.F. Smith, and the strengthening of Fort Reno, irrespective of the wishes and warnings of Red Cloud and other leading Sioux chiefs. Jim Bridger was the man selected to act as a chief guide to the expedition because of his great knowledge of the country into which the command was going, and also because of his intimate acquaintance with all Indian wiles and subtlety. En route, the party entered a deep gorge of the Platte River, where some of the members of the expedition desired to go ahead and examine the canyon. Bridger was consulted as to the safety of this plan and remarked, "Better not go too fur. That there's Injuns enough lying under wolf skins or skulking on them cliffs. I'm a-telling ye, they foller ye allus. They've seen ye every day, and take it from me, when ye don't see any of them, that's just the time to watch out for their devilment." Next morning it was learned that but 9 miles distant, Indians had swooped down on the ranch of a man named Mills and had run off his stock. Bridger then stated that there was no doubt but that the marauders were members of Red Cloud's band who'd already begun to put into execution the threats of the great Sioux leader. And Bridger further declared that in giving presents to the Indians at the Laramie Peace Council in June, they had simply made gifts to positive enemies. Also, that the expedition was advancing directly in the face of hostiles. The Laramie Peace Conference in June 1866 was an important one, and it had been hoped by the government that no objections would be made by the Sioux to opening the proposed wagon road into Montana and erecting necessary forts to maintain soldiers in that part of the country. At this council, Jim Bridger was an attentive spectator, and Colonel Carrington thus describes him in Absaroka, Land of Massacre. That's a book. In front of them all, and to the left of the table, sitting on a low seat with elbows on his knees and chin buried in his hands, sat the noted James Bridger, whose 44 years upon the frontier had made him as keen and suspicious of Indians as any Indian could be of another. The old man, already somewhat bowed with age, after long residence among the Crows as a friend and favorite chief, and having incurred the bitter hatred of the Cheyennes and Sioux alike, knew full well that his scalp would be the proudest trophy they could bear to their solemn feasts. And there he sat, or crouched, as watchful as though old times had come again, and he was once more to mingle in the fight, or renew the ordeal of his many hairbreadth escapes and spirited adventures. To us he was invariably straightforward, truthful, and reliable. His sagacity, knowledge of woodcraft, and knowledge of the Indian was wonderful, and his heart was warm and his feelings tender whenever he was confided in or made a friend. He cannot read, but enjoys being read too. He was charmed with Shakespeare, but doubted the Bible story of Samson tying foxes by the tails and with firebrands burning the wheat of the Philistines. After Carrington's expedition had reached the spot on which it was determined to erect the post known later as Fort Phil Kearny, and had begun the work of cutting and hauling logs from the Piney, 6 or 7 miles distant, Bridger was ever on the alert and watchful. He would walk about, says Carrington, constantly scanning the opposite hills that commanded a good view of the fort, as if he suspected Indians of having scouts behind every sage clump or fallen cottonwood. That Jim Bridger was a great comfort to the few women and children who were at the Fort Phil Kearny with their husbands and fathers during those trying months of almost daily warfare and Indian savagery is plainly evident from the mention made of the famous scout and Mrs. Carrington's Army Life on the Plains. She says there was one faithful, honest, and simple-minded white man at the post, the colonel's confidential guide at all times, who seemed instinctively to know the invisible as well as the visible operations of the Indians. Good old Jim Bridger. His devotion to the ladies and children and his willingness to cheer them as best he could were as prized as were his quaint tales of experience among the Crow Indians. I learned afterward from the colonel that the department commander, Philip St. George Cook, living in Omaha, even at the time of our greatest peril, ordered the discharge of Bridger because of the expense, and on the back of the order was endorsed by the colonel, impossible of execution, and Bridger was retained. From 1862 until 1869 or 1870, Bridger remained on the plains in the capacity of guide and scout for various government expeditions sent against hostile Indians, and in locating the most feasible routes between the different military posts already or about to be established in the Indian country. After the government in 1868 had abandoned the forts along the Bozeman Trail, which Colonel Carrington had built and maintained through most trying times, Bridger was transferred from these posts to Fort Laramie, where he was a familiar figure for many years. End of Part 5.